Adolf Hitler. I mean, the name itself is basically shorthand for pure evil, right? For decades, he's been the ultimate villain in our history books. But what if that story, the one we all know, is, well, a little too simple? What if it's a narrative designed to hide a much more complex and, frankly, a much more uncomfortable truth about all of our shared history? Let's dig into that.
So, these are some of Hitler's last words. Pretty defiant, huh? It's a really chilling thing to say. But it makes you wonder, is that just the rambling of a complete madman? Or did he actually see himself as part of some bigger picture? A story where maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the only villain on the stage.
And that really gets to the heart of what we're exploring today. Was Adolf Hitler some kind of unique, one-of-a-kind monster, an exception to all the rules of history? Or was he a product of his time, a convenient villain manufactured to take all the blame for a global system that was already broken and failing?
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll kick things off with how Hitler even got into power in the first place. Then we'll compare his atrocities to others from that era. We'll dive deep into the long history of anti-Semitism, look at World War II as a collective failure, and then wrap it all up by asking why history might need a manufactured villain.
Okay, so first up, how does a regular soldier end up becoming an all-powerful dictator? And the crazy thing is, the story doesn't really start with Hitler. It starts with Germany, totally defeated and humiliated after World War I.
So picture this, 1918. Germany surrenders, and the entire country just descends into chaos. You've got the super harsh Treaty of Versailles in 1919, a failed attempt to overthrow the government in 23, and then bam, the Great Depression hits the whole world in 29. It was the perfect storm of desperation, and in the middle of all that chaos, Hitler makes his move, becoming chancellor in 1933, and then the absolute leader just 1 year later. Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles, calling it a peace treaty is a stretch. It was more like a punishment. It slapped Germany with crippling debt, took away their land, and shrunk their military down to almost nothing. Inflation got so bad that people were literally using wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. This created this massive, simmering anger and a deep, deep hunger for a leader who could make Germany feel strong again.
And Hitler? He saw this anger and just masterfully played on it. He got up there and promised to make Germany great again. Then, in a slick political move, the old guard conservatives made him chancellor, thinking, oh, he's just a puppet, we can control him. Big mistake. When the German parliament building mysteriously burned down, Hitler seized his chance, declared a national emergency, and pushed through the Enabling Act, which basically handed him the powers of a dictator. Just like that, democracy was gone, and he wiped out all of his opponents.
Okay, now we have to talk about the most horrific part of all this, the mass killings. But here's where things get complicated. The source material we're looking at really pushes us to see these numbers not just by themselves, but to put them in a wider and honestly a much more uncomfortable context.
When you think of Hitler, you think of one number: 6 million. Roughly 6 million Jewish people systematically murdered in the Holocaust. It's an act of horror that's almost impossible to even comprehend, and it's what has cemented his place in history as the ultimate monster.
Now hold that number in your head for a second, and let's look at another one, 20 million. That's the estimated number of people killed by Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. We're talking about his political purges, the hellish Gulag labor camps, and a famine he engineered. That's, what, more than 3 times the number of victims in the Holocaust.
And believe it or not, the numbers just keep going up. Over in China, Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward policy created the single biggest famine in human history. We're talking about an estimated 40 million people. It was so bad, there are reports of people forced to eat tree leaves and dirt just to try and survive.
So this leads to a really, really important question. Why is the perception so different? Hitler is without a doubt seen as the ultimate evil. But Stalin? He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, twice. Mao is often called a cultural revolutionary, and the Japanese general behind the horrific Unit 73-1 experiments, his scientists were secretly hired by the US after the war. The crime is the same, mass murder on an industrial scale. So why is only one of these names the one we all associate with pure evil?
Well, the source we're examining offers a pretty blunt answer. The idea is that history isn't just what happened, it's a story. And the winners of the war, they get to write that story. And when you're writing the story, you always make yourself look like the hero.
Okay, let's switch gears to another huge piece of this puzzle: anti-Semitism. The story we usually hear is that Hitler basically invented this modern, weaponized hatred of Jewish people. But what if that's not the whole picture? What if it's actually a much, much older story?
Just take a look at this timeline. This isn't something that started in the 20th century. We're talking about the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, medieval England, Spain during the Inquisition, even into the modern era. The persecution and expulsion of Jews is a tragic pattern that has been repeating for literally thousands of years.
So here's the contrast the source draws for us. The common narrative says Hitler created modern anti-Semitism. The argument here is that he didn't create it at all. The hatred was already there, like a deep river flowing through history. He just figured out how to build a dam, channel all that toxic energy, and turn it into a political weapon.
So why was this the weapon he chose? Well, it was really a perfect storm of reasons. He could blame Jewish bankers for Germany's loss in the war. He could tap into resentment about their influence in German culture and finance. Heck, some say it was even personal. But most importantly, it was the single most powerful tool he had to unite a divided, broken country against one common enemy.
All right, so that brings us to the big one, World War II. The simple story is, one man started the deadliest war in human history. But what if it wasn't that simple? What if this wasn't about one bad guy, but about a total, catastrophic failure of the entire global system?
I mean, think about who else was on the board here. England pretty much gave Hitler a green light when they signed the Munich Agreement. The Soviet Union literally signed a deal with him to carve up Poland. Huge global companies like IBM and Ford were providing technology and support. And of course, the whole mess started because the Allied powers themselves imposed that brutal treaty that set the stage for all this in the first place.
And all of this leads to this idea of shared evil. It's the concept that a disaster this big doesn't just spring from one person's mind. It needs a whole system of people looking the other way, people helping out, people making a profit, a network of complicit actors whose role in the story often gets conveniently whitewashed when the victors write the history books.
So this all brings us to the final piece of the argument, the idea of Hitler as this manufactured villain. It's a challenging idea, for sure, but why is that particular narrative, the one-man evil story, so powerful and so persistent?
Well, think about it. If you can pile all the evil in the world onto one guy, that's incredibly convenient, isn't it? It allows the winners to justify their own questionable actions during the war. It takes a really messy, complicated story about greed, politics, and global failure and turns it into a simple bedtime story. Good guys versus the ultimate bad guy. I mean, you can't have a hero without a villain, right? How else is the hero supposed to look so great? By making Hitler the absolute personification of evil, it became a lot easier for the Allied powers to frame themselves as the unquestionable saviors of the world, neatly brushing aside all the messy complexities of their own involvement.
And that's where we'll leave it, with this final question. Now, to be absolutely clear, none of this is about letting Hitler off the hook. What he did was monstrous, period. But it is about challenging ourselves to question the simple stories we are told. Because if history really is written by the victors, it forces us to ask a really tough question. What other stories aren't we hearing, and who are the villains in those?